Just because the job is finished does not mean the money is in your business. That is where a lot of insulation contractors get squeezed. The crew did the work, the invoice went out, the customer said they would pay soon, but payroll is still coming. Materials still need to be paid. Fuel, insurance, trucks, and overhead still keep moving. And until that payment actually lands, the job is not helping your cash flow. It is just completed work, sitting in limbo. I'm Josh Savage, founder of Savage Financials. I help insulation contractors understand where cash is getting stuck, where profit is leaking, and why the business can feel tight even when the schedule is full. One of the biggest cash flow problems I see is not always a lack of work. It is a gap between finishing the project and collecting the money. That gap matters because a finished job does not pay the crew. Collecting cash does. I was working with a contractor a while back that couldn't figure out why cash always felt tight. The strange part was the jobs themselves were actually profitable. We went back through them and they were making consistently over 30% gross margin. They weren't underpricing the work. Customers were happy. Schedule was full. On the surface, nothing looked broken. So instead of looking at the business as a whole, we started looking at each individual job, not just the bid, but the entire life of the job. When was the deposit collected? When were the materials purchased? When did labor hit payroll? When were supplier invoices due? When was the final payment actually expected to come in? We built out a job underwriting process that looked at both profitability and cash flow. It wasn't just, can we make money on this job? It was, can this job fund itself from start to finish without creating problems for the business? That's when we found the real issue. Almost every job went cash negative before it was finished. The deposit would come in, but then material, labor, and everything else started going out faster than cash was coming in. By the end of the project, they were underwater, and the only thing bringing them back into positive cash flow was collecting the final payment. Most of the time, that worked, until it didn't. Sometimes the customer wanted to wait a few days before the final walkthrough. Sometimes there were a couple of small punch list items. Sometimes they just took their time paying. Meanwhile, payroll is still due. Suppliers still wanted to get paid. Fuel, insurance, and overhead didn't care that the customer hadn't written the check yet. The owner kept thinking that doing more jobs would solve the problem. In reality, more jobs would have just meant more projects sitting underwater waiting on final payment. So we changed the underwriting structure. We put guardrails in place where a job couldn't go cash negative unless it was for a very small amount or a very short period of time. Even then, we looked at what every other active job was doing because one job doesn't exist by itself. It has to fit into the cash needs of the entire portfolio. We also changed how they billed. Instead of simply asking for the final payment at the end, we built payment milestones that better match when cash is actually leaving the business. On top of that, we intentionally priced the jobs a little higher, but offered customers discounts if payments were made by certain milestones or dates. The customer felt like they were getting a deal for paying on time, while the contractor ended up collecting the same amount they wanted in the first place. Nothing about the work itself changed, but cash flow changed because the jobs were finally funding themselves instead of the business acting like a bank. I think this is where a lot of contractors accidentally confuse profit with cash. They're not the same thing. A job can be profitable and still put a ton of pressure on your business if the cash doesn't come in until after you've already paid for everything. That's exactly what was happening here. The jobs were making money. The business just wasn't collecting that money soon enough. The first lesson is that cash flow has a timing component to it. It isn't just about how much money comes in, it's about when it comes in. If your suppliers need to be paid this week, payroll hits this week, and your customer doesn't pay for another 2 weeks, you can have a profitable job that's still creating financial pressure today. That's why payment structure matters just as much as pricing. The goal is to have jobs that fund themselves as they move through the project, instead of relying on one final payment to make everything work. The second lesson is that none of this is obvious unless you have visibility into it. I've seen really smart business owners and really good accountants struggle to figure out why cash always feels tight. Not because they weren't capable, but because the systems they're using don't show the timing of cash moving through each job. An income statement tells you if you made money. It doesn't tell you when you ran out of cash. Until we built the underwriting process and laid every job out on a timeline, this contractor couldn't actually see where the pressure was coming from. Once we could see it, the solutions became pretty straightforward. That's why I believe every contractor should have some type of system that shows both profitability and cash flow before the job starts. Not just whether the job will make money, but when cash comes in, when it goes out, and how that job fits into everything else the business already has going on. Without that, you're constantly reacting instead of planning. You're stressing over payroll because the customer still hasn't paid. You're putting materials on a credit card because cash is tied up in completed work. You're drawing on a line of credit or paying for expensive short-term financing just to bridge a gap that could have been avoided. You start delaying purchases, pushing off decisions, or hoping checks arrive before bills are due. That's exhausting, and it's completely different from simply being busy. Because once you have both the right cash flow timing and the visibility to actually see it, you stop reacting to problems after they happen and start preventing them before they ever show up. The business becomes more stable. Payroll becomes less stressful. You don't need to rely on emergency financing nearly as often because you can see the pressure coming before it hits. Instead of constantly putting out fires, you're making decisions ahead of time, and that's what leads to a healthier business, more consistent profits, and honestly a much better quality of life. The goal is not just to finish jobs. The goal is to turn finished jobs into collected cash faster. That means clearer payment terms, cleaner invoice follow-up, better expectations up front, and fewer jobs sitting unpaid while your expenses keep moving. Because cash flow gets easier when money is not stuck in completed work. work. In the next video, I'll talk about how small customer requests can turn into free labor if you do not catch them early. And if you want help seeing where cash is getting stuck inside your jobs, invoices, and payment processes, book a call here at savagefinancials.com.